She signed the contract on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she was carrying the most powerful bloodline on the continent, and not a single wolf in that pack saw her as anything more than a warm body to use and discard. Mara was human, broke, desperate, and completely unprepared for what that ink would cost her. The Voss pack didn't want her. They needed her. There's a brutal difference. She was chosen not for her strength, but for her silence. Her isolation. The fact that no one would come looking if things went wrong. And things went very wrong. Her body burned from the inside. The pack watched her suffer and called it progress. They gave her rules, a locked room, and a title she was never meant to keep, Surrogate. Nothing more. But then Selim appeared. Not to check on the heir. Not to give orders. Just there. Standing in doorways. Watching her with eyes that had no business being that troubled. That hungry. That guilty. His wolf should have felt nothing when she walked past. It felt everything. And that was the moment the ancient laws of the pack started to crack. If this story already has your pulse up, subscribe, drop a comment below, and share this with someone who loves a love story that was never supposed to happen. Chapter 1. The Biological Gamble. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. That was how long it took to change Mara's life forever. 11 minutes in a cold room, under cold lights, surrounded by people who never once made eye contact with her. They spoke about her body like she wasn't in it. They referenced her blood panels, her protein markers, her uterine resilience. They used words like optimal and viable and acceptable risk. Not once did anyone say her name. The embryo was engineered. Selim Boss's genetics, extracted and refined, compressed into something that the pack's lead physician called a concentrated legacy. The most powerful shifter bloodline on the continent. For centuries of alpha dominance distilled into a single, fragile beginning. And they put it inside a human woman who had eaten ramen for dinner 3 nights in a row because her mother's dialysis didn't leave room in the budget for anything else. Mara lay flat on the procedure table and stared at the ceiling and breathed through her nose. She had told herself she would be professional, clinical, that this was a transaction, that she would take the money, carry the child, hand over the heir, and walk away with enough to rebuild her life. She was very good at telling herself things. The physician's assistant handed her a printed aftercare sheet on the way out. No eye contact. No, are you all right? Just paper. Just protocol. Mara folded it into her coat pocket and walked back to her assigned quarters alone. That night, she pressed her palm flat against her stomach in the dark and whispered, "I've got you." She didn't know why she said it. The embryo was barely a cluster of cells. But something in her chest had already made a decision that her contract hadn't authorized. Chapter 2. The Cost of Carrying Power. The first week was manageable. The second week was not. Her temperature spiked on day 9. The pack physician logged it as an adjustment response and prescribed fluids. Day 11, her joints locked up so badly she couldn't open a water bottle. Day 13, she woke up screaming from a dream she couldn't remember, only that it was made entirely of heat and howling and a darkness so ancient it had no name. The physician logged that too. Emotional volatility. Expected. What they didn't log, what none of them acknowledged, was the way the heir was already pushing against biology. Selim's bloodline was not passive. It was not patient. It was an alpha line, hundreds of years compressed, and it recognized no vessel as its superior. Not even the one keeping it alive. Mara's body was working 3 times as hard as any wolf surrogate would have needed to. Her immune system was in constant negotiation with something it had never been built to carry. Her blood pressure swung wildly. She lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks. The pack physicians adjusted her 4 supplements and updated their charts and moved on. She asked one of them, quietly, if this level of physical stress was expected. He looked at her the way you look at a piece of equipment that has started making an unfamiliar noise. Curious. Assessing. Mildly inconvenient. The air is strong, he said. That's what we want. He left. Mara sat with that answer for a long time. The heir's strength was the goal. Her survival was the variable. She understood that now with a clarity that settled into her bones like something cold and permanent. She was not a person here. She was a condition. A temporary biological environment for something the pack valued infinitely more than her. And still, every night, she pressed her hand to her stomach and said the same thing. I've got you. If this story is already pulling at something in you, you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me what you're feeling right now. The people reading alongside you want to know they're not the only ones. Chapter 3. The Silent Scent. Selim Voss did not visit the medical wing. This was intentional. Deliberate. He had made that decision the night the contract was finalized, and he had not questioned it since. The arrangement was clinical. The surrogate was a variable, not a relationship. He had been clear with himself about this. And yet, day 4, he took a different corridor to his study. The one that passed the east courtyard, where the medical wing's recovery garden sat behind a glass partition. He told himself it was a shorter route. It wasn't. He saw her through the glass. She was sitting on the stone bench in the pale morning light. Her knees pulled up to her chest. Her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was reading something, a paperback, something battered and well-loved, and her lips moved slightly as she read, like she was tasting the words. His wolf went very still. This was unusual. His wolf was never still. It was ancient and aggressive, and it had opinions about everything and everyone within a quarter mile. But when Selim looked at this woman through the glass, the animal inside him simply paused. The way you pause when something doesn't match any pattern you've encountered before. She had no scent. Not to his wolf. She was biologically invisible. A blank space in the sensory world his wolf navigated by instinct. Blank spaces didn't hold his attention. This one did. He walked on. He put it away. He had a pack to run and a council meeting in 40 minutes, and a beta who was already watching him with eyes that knew too much. But the next morning, he took the same corridor again. Chapter 4. Acceptable Parameters. The elders called their first formal review at week 6. Selim sat at the head of the long obsidian table and listened to Elder Pryn lay out the numbers with the satisfied precision of a man who believed everything in the world could be reduced to data. The heir's development markers are ahead of projection. The surrogate's physical metrics are within acceptable parameters. If she holds. When she holds, Selim said. A silence. Elder Pryn smiled thinly. Of course. When she holds, the lineage ceremony can proceed at the 8-month mark as planned. Selim held the man's gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the phrase acceptable parameters was sitting wrong in his chest. Like a splinter. Small. Irritating. He didn't examine it. Not then. But Elder Vale, the oldest of the council, a woman who had watched 4 generations of Voss Alphas grow into their titles, was watching him. She didn't speak during the meeting. She never did. She simply watched. And when Selim's eyes accidentally crossed hers on the way out of the room, her expression held something he hadn't seen from her in years. A warning. Soren caught his arm in the corridor after. The elders are concerned, she said. Low. Flat. The voice she used for things that weren't requests. About what? About the fact that you've walked past the medical wing garden 6 mornings in a row. He didn't answer. She is not Pack, Soren said. She is not a mate candidate. She is not even a name in the history books. She is a function, Selim. A necessary one. Do not make her anything else. He held her gaze for one long, still beat. Get the physician to update her pain management protocol, he said. The current one isn't working. He walked away. Soren watched him go with an expression that lived somewhere between grief and dread. Chapter 5, Week 14. Mara was in the medical bay for a routine blood draw. Unremarkable. Tuesday morning. She had done 7 of these already. She knew the chair, the angle of the light, the specific cold of the alcohol swab. What she didn't know was that her body had hit a wall. The seizure came without warning. One moment she was answering a physician's question about her sleep quality. The next, she was on the floor. The world was white noise and distance, and a heat in her chest so intense it felt like something was clawing to get out. She came back to herself in fragments. The ceiling, the lights, the sound of running footsteps, and then a voice she had never heard directed at her before. Low, controlled. But underneath the control, something raw. What happened? Exactly what happened? Start talking. Selim was standing in the doorway. He had come from somewhere. She could tell by the tension still in his shoulders, the way he was breathing just slightly faster than normal. Like he had moved quickly to get here. Like something had pulled him. The physician started explaining. Selim wasn't looking at the physician. He was looking at her. Mara met his eyes from the bed. She was pale. Her hair was a wreck. She had an oxygen monitor clipped to her finger like a tiny red light. She probably looked exactly as wrecked as she felt. I'm fine, she said. His jaw tightened. His eyes gray, she noticed. Not silver. Actual gray, like winter water, like stone in low light, did something complicated. They moved across her face the way hands move across something breakable. Carefully. Like an assessment that had stopped being clinical somewhere in the middle. He stood there for 60 seconds without speaking. Then he left. But 3 things changed by the end of the day. The blood draw protocol was suspended. A new physician, private, credentialed, gentle in a way the PAC's doctors weren't, arrived before dinner. And Mara was told her quarters were being moved. To the main house. The East Wing. Down a hall that smelled like cedar and old books. Down a hall, she would realize later, that ran parallel to Selim's study. She stood in the doorway of her new room for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that he had done this. She thought about his eyes on her face. The careful way they'd moved. The weight of 60 seconds of silence from a man who, by every account, never wasted a single one. She told herself it was about the air. She was very good at telling herself things. If you haven't hit that like button yet, now is the moment. Because what happens next, it's the part they were both trying to prevent. And the part neither of them could stop. Chapter 6. Spiritual Friction. Week 18 arrived like a season changing. Subtle at first. Then undeniable. Mara started waking before dawn. Not from pain. From a pull. A warmth that gathered at the base of her neck and spread slowly, like sunlight coming through a window. It had no source she could name. It simply existed, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She didn't acknowledge it. She got up. She made tea. She sat by the window of her East Wing room and watched the estate's grounds go from black to gray to gold in the morning light, and she kept her face very still and her thoughts very managed, and her hand, inevitably, eventually, pressed flat against her stomach. "What are you doing in there?" she whispered once. The warmth answered. Faint. Rhythmic. Like a second pulse layered beneath her own. She set down her tea. Across the house, in a study that smelled of cedar and old decisions, Selim Voss sat at his desk and stared at the same wall for the 3rd morning in a row. He wasn't sleeping. He knew why. He refused to engage with why. He had reports to review and council decisions to finalize, and a pack that needed an alpha who was present and functional and not sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning thinking about the way a human woman had looked at him without flinching. Everyone flinched. She didn't. He dreamed about her voice. Not romantic dreams, he would have been able to dismiss those. These were quieter. Just her voice. The careful, conserving way she spoke. Like someone who had learned that taking up space cost something. Like someone who had been taught, by a world that didn't mean to be cruel, but was anyway, that small was safer. It made something in him that had been very cold for a very long time go entirely still. He stood abruptly. Went to the window. Stood with his hands braced against the frame and his forehead nearly touching the glass. His wolf, who had been restless for 18 weeks, did something unprecedented. It pushed forward. Not aggressively. Not in the hunting way. In a different way. A searching way. The direction it pushed was east. Stop, he told it. It didn't stop. Chapter 7. The Mirror. The first mirror moment happened on a Wednesday. Mara was in the library. She had discovered it in week 15, a room that the pack clearly considered decorative rather than functional, which meant no one ever came in, when the sensation hit her. A sudden heat behind her sternum. Sharp. Real. Like something had pressed a warm hand directly over her heart from the inside. She gasped and gripped the shelf. Across the estate, in the training yard, Selim had stopped mid-movement. His sparring partner, a young wolf who had been trying not to show how terrified he was, nearly ran into him. Selim stood absolutely still. There was a warmth in his chest he didn't recognize. It wasn't pain. It wasn't his wolf. It was something else. Something layered. Something that felt faintly, impossibly, like it was coming from outside himself. He pressed his fist to his sternum. The young wolf took 3 careful steps backward. It happened again that evening. And again the next morning. Small flares of shared sensation. A pressure. A warmth. Once, and this was the one that kept him awake until 3, a wave of something that could only be described as longing. Sourceless. Enormous. Landing in his chest like weather. He was not a man who felt longing. He had trained that out of himself years ago. After the grief. After the loss. He had rebuilt himself around certainty and function and the cold, clean satisfaction of control. Longing had no place in that architecture. And yet, he called the lead physician. Asked, with deliberate precision, whether there were documented cases of a carrying surrogate's emotional state creating physiological feedback in the biological donor parent. The physician blinked. That would require a neurological tether of some kind. Which isn't, biologically, between a human and a shifter, that's not. I didn't ask what it was. I asked if it was documented. Pause. No, it isn't. Selim hung up. He sat with that for a very long time. Chapter 8. The Seventh Covenant. The lunar laws were not suggestions. They were carved into the founding stone of every pack covenant in the country. Written in the oldest dialect of the pack tongue, which most modern wolves couldn't even read. Passed down through elders the way other families passed down recipes and photographs. The seventh covenant was the one that mattered here. No soul bond shall form between a wolf of standing and a creature outside the shifted line. Should such an alignment be claimed, the claiming party forfeits rank, lineage, and pack protection. The bond itself shall be dissolved by lunar right. What the moon does not recognize, the moon shall unmake. The elders knew the laws by heart. All of them. Elder Vale could recite the seventh covenant in her sleep. She was reciting it now. Quietly. To herself. In the hallway outside the library where she had just watched, through the gap in the door, as Mara stood with her hand pressed to her chest and her eyes closed and her face wearing an expression that Elder Vale recognized with a cold and absolute certainty. She had worn that expression herself. 60 years ago, when her own bond had formed. She turned and walked quickly towards Soren's quarters. They had to move fast. Chapter 9. The Bloom. The bloom happened on a night with no moon. Which was, the elders would later say, the most offensive detail of all. Soul bonds were lunar events. They required the moon's witness. They required ceremony and preparation and blood covenant. They did not happen on moonless Tuesdays in the east wing of a private estate because a human woman had a nightmare and a wolf alpha heard her cry out from 2 hallways away and was in her doorway before he understood that he had moved. Mara was sitting up in bed, both hands pressed over her heart, her breath coming in hard, fast pulls. Whatever she had dreamed was still on her face, open, raw, undefended. The face of someone who had forgotten, in the disorientation of waking, to put her armor back on. Selim stood in the doorway. He had not knocked. He had not thought about knocking. He had simply moved, pulled by something that sat below thought, below decision, below the part of him that made choices, and now he was here, in her doorway, in the dark, and she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and neither of them spoke. And then he smelled it. It hit him like something physical. Like a hand against the chest. Like sound turned solid. A scent that hadn't existed 24 hours ago, warm, complex, layered like something ancient and new at once. Cedar and rain, and something he had no word for because his wolf had never encountered it before and was not, in this moment, being remotely rational about the encounter. His wolf didn't pause this time. His wolf surged. He gripped the doorframe. "Selim," she said. Quiet. Uncertain. She could see something happening in his face that she had never seen there before. Not cold now. Not controlled. Something beneath both of those things, surfacing like pressure through ice. "You're safe," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. Rougher. She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you?" He had no answer for that. He stood in her doorway until her breathing steadied. Until the nightmare faded from her face and something else replaced it, something careful and wondering and afraid in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the specific terror of wanting something you were never supposed to have. He left before dawn. But her scent followed him down the hallway, down the stairs, into his study, into his sleep. It would not stop following him. Chapter 10. By morning, Soren knew. She appeared in Selim's study at 6 with the expression of someone delivering news they had hoped to never deliver. Her scent bloomed last night. He said nothing. The night staff reported it. Elder Vale has already convened a private session. They're calling it an anomaly. They want to run tests. They want to. No. Soren stopped. They want to dissolve the arrangement, she said carefully. Remove her from the estate. Bring in a wolf surrogate. Start the process again before the bond deepens further. Something moved through Selim's face. It passed quickly. But Soren had known him for 15 years and she saw it clearly. The heir is 22 weeks, he said. Any interruption at this stage carries significant risk. Selim. That is my position. The heir's safety is the priority. The surrogate remains until delivery. And after delivery? The pause was very small. After delivery, we discuss it. Soren stared at him. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were doing the calculation, the one where she weighed loyalty against honesty, and usually chose loyalty and hated herself slightly for it. They will move against her, she said quietly. The elders. If this bond continues, if it becomes undeniable, they will call a lunar rite and they will not be gentle about it. Selim stood. Moved to the window. Stood with his back to her and his hands clasped behind him. Outside, across the courtyard, a light was on in the east wing. He watched it for a long time. Then nothing, he said, becomes undeniable. Share this with someone right now. Someone who believes in love that was never supposed to survive. Because what's coming, it will break something open in both of you. Chapter 11. Shattering Lunar Law. The council met at the new moon. 31 wolves in a room that had witnessed every major pact decision for 2 centuries. Stone walls. Candlelight. The smell of old power and older fear. Elder Pryn read the 7th covenant aloud. No soul bond shall form between a wolf of standing and a creature outside the shifted line. He set the text down. The surrogate is human. The alpha's wolf has registered her scent. This is not disputed. What is disputed is whether we acknowledge what this means or whether we act to prevent it from becoming what it is already becoming. Silence. The lunar rite requires the alpha's consent, Elder Vale said. Her voice was dry, deliberate. Or the alpha's incapacitation. Every head in the room turned to Selim. He sat at the head of the table the way he always sat. Still. Immovable. His gray eyes moving across each face with the patience of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to make a room go quiet. You will not touch her, he said. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was the flattest, most absolute thing anyone in that room had ever heard him say. Elder Pryn's face went carefully neutral. The law, Selim said, does not account for this. And neither do you. She is human. She is. She is carrying my heir. She has been carrying him through a process that should have killed a wolf, let alone a human. She has not asked for protection. She has not asked for recognition. She has asked for nothing except to be allowed to do what she contracted to do. He paused. I am telling you now that she will have every protection this pack can offer. I am telling you that the right will not proceed. I am telling you that if anyone in this room moves against her, they move against me. The candles flickered. Nobody spoke. Elder Vale looked at Selim for a very long time. Her face unreadable. Her eyes ancient. Then, slowly, she nodded. Once. It was not agreement. It was recognition. The nod of someone who had seen something like this before and knew there was no stopping it. The moon had witnessed. The bond had formed. The laws existed to prevent this exact thing, and had failed, as laws sometimes do, against something older and more stubborn than legislation. Against two people who, against every design and decree and biological probability, had found each other in the space between what they were supposed to be. Chapter 12. Your father is an idiot. Mara didn't know about the council meeting until 3 days later. Soren told her. Concisely. Without editorializing. Just the facts, delivered with the flat efficiency of someone who had accepted a reality they didn't entirely like. Mara sat with it. She thought about the contract. The metal table. The ring against the surface. Sign here. Here. And here. The debt that had been the only reason she walked into that chamber. The transaction that was supposed to be clean and finite and entirely without consequence. She thought about a man standing in her doorway in the dark. Are you safe? And his face, doing that complicated thing it did when someone asked him a question he actually had to think about. She pressed her hand to her stomach. 24 weeks now. She could feel movement sometimes. Small. Exploratory. The air, finding the edges of the world he was being made in. Your father is an idiot, she said softly. But I think he's a good one. Chapter 13. Shoulder to Shoulder. The weeks that followed were not easy. Pack members who had been cold became hostile. Whispers became confrontations. Twice, Mara found her door blocked by wolves who looked at her with the specific contempt of people whose certainty had been threatened. She walked past them both times without breaking stride. Without flinching. She had learned something, somewhere in the last months, that she hadn't known when she arrived. She was not disposable. She was not a vessel. She was not a temporary convenience. She was the woman who had carried the impossible, who had held something ancient and powerful inside a body that was never supposed to manage it, and had managed it anyway. Who had stayed soft in a place designed to harden her. Who had whispered "I've got you" in the dark when no one was listening and meant it every single time. Selim appeared beside her the second time she found her door blocked. He said nothing. He simply stood next to her, shoulder to shoulder, and looked at the wolves in front of them with that flat, still gaze that needed no translation. They moved. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. But she felt his arm against hers. The warmth of it. The solidity. And in her chest, that second pulse, steady now, certain, no longer asking for permission, pressed against her ribs like something that had decided to stay. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her. You didn't have to do that, she said. No, he agreed. He said it like a man who understood exactly what he was admitting. Chapter 14. The Winter Solstice. The heir was born on the winter solstice. Long night. Longest of the year. The kind of dark that the pack had always treated as sacred, a threshold between what was and what would be. He arrived at 3 in the morning. Healthy. Strong. Loud in the way of things that have been waiting a long time to announce themselves. The pack physician held him up with the practiced reverence of someone handling legacy. But it was Mara's arms he was placed in first. Nobody had ordered that. Nobody had planned it. The physician simply did it. The way you do something that is so obviously right that procedure doesn't occur to you. Mara held him. Her face wrecked and exhausted and open in a way she no longer had the energy to manage. She looked down at him, dark hair, Gray eyes that would probably stay gray, a mouth already set with a stubbornness that was entirely familiar, and something in her chest that had been wound tight for 9 months simply released. She looked up. Selim was in the doorway. He had been there the whole time. His face was doing the thing it had been doing since week 14, that complicated softening that he kept trying to stop and kept failing at. His eyes were bright in a way she had never seen from him. He was holding himself very still the way you do when you are trying not to let a room full of people see something enormous happening inside you. She did it, the physician said quietly. To him. With a kind of awe that sat outside her professional vocabulary. Selim's eyes didn't move from Mara's face. She did, he said. He crossed the room. Slowly. With the deliberate stillness of someone moving through something significant and choosing to feel all of it. He stopped at the edge of the bed, looked down at his heir, then back at her. His hand moved, very slowly, and covered hers where she held the child. Warm, steady, certain. She didn't pull away. The air made a small sound between them. Impatient already. Impatient in the way of someone born knowing he had somewhere to be. Mara laughed quiet, raw, the first real laugh she had allowed herself in 9 months, and the sound of it did to Selim's chest what her scent had done to his wolf. It made everything go still. And in that stillness, with the winter pressing against the windows and the pack beyond the door and the ancient laws cracked clean through at the foundation, something settled between them that had no word in any language anyone in that building spoke. But the moon recognized it. Even on a night when she couldn't be seen. She recognized it. Chapter 15. The New Hierarchy. The Voss pack would spend the next decade arguing about what Mara was. Historians would call it a biological anomaly. Elders would call it a violation. Pack scholars would write papers about the protein marker in her blood, the statistical improbability of the soul bond, the unprecedented nature of an heir born from human endurance and wolf legacy. None of them would get it right. Because the truth was simple. Embarrassingly, beautifully simple. She was a woman who had walked into the hardest room of her life with nothing but desperation and a quiet, stubborn kindness she had never once thought to weaponize. And she had changed everything. The heir, Selim, registered his name on the winter solstice record with a deliberateness that left no room for council objection, grew up knowing both of his origins. Wolf and human. Power and patience. Ancient bloodline and ordinary courage. He grew up watching his father stand at doorways, hand against the frame, watching his mother with eyes that had forgotten how to be cold. He grew up understanding that the most radical thing a person could do in a world built on hierarchy was to love something it told you was beneath you. And he carried that lesson forward. Into the pack. Into the laws. Into the new covenants written not in the language of dominance, but in the language of two people who had chosen each other against every ancient instruction. The moon, eventually, rewrote her own rules. She had been waiting for a reason to. That's the story. And if it moved you, if Mara's quiet courage, or the way Selim stood in that doorway, or the sound of her laugh in a cold winter room did something to your chest, then you already know what to do. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to believe that love finds its way through the cracks in impossible things. And leave a comment below. Tell me which moment got you. I read every single one. Until next time.